All right, Mike, you got to get in on this one. We expect former Vice President Joe Biden to jump into the crowded Democratic primary field tomorrow. Two sources close to Vice President Biden with direct knowledge of the planning confirmed to NBC News the former vice president plans to announce his run tomorrow morning with an online video. He then will travel to Pittsburgh on Monday for an event at a local union hall, NBC has learned. Biden then plans in the following weeks to kick off his campaign with a tour of 4 early voting states: Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. Meanwhile, Biden will enter the 2020 race with a huge fundraising disadvantage. The New York Times reports that opposed to his leading opponent, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who's raised more than $26 million across his various committees, Biden will enter the race with $0. The former vice president's campaign would have to raise $100,000 every day until Christmas in order to match Sanders' fundraising totals at the beginning of April. Mike, obviously Joe Biden will catch up in fundraising. He knows a lot of people in high places in the Democratic Party. What's his mindset? What's his mentality as he hops into the race tomorrow?
Well, I think his mentality is that he is the only guy who can certainly beat Donald Trump. I mean, that's his whole card. That's the card he's going to play. He has begun to make fundraising calls himself, which is unusual. He doesn't like to do it. But there's the peril for him in that Bernie Sanders and multiple other candidates in the field, Jim Vandehei, have specific knowledge of how to reach low, $25, $30 contributors, repeat contributors. The Biden campaign doesn't have that base yet, and they're going to have to go initially, I would think, to large donors who drop down big checks at fundraising dinners, and that way the other candidates will lash back at them, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a couple problems for Biden, right? Like, he's getting in and he's going to make the argument, I'm the only one who could beat Trump. But most Democrats are going to look at the polls and see that there's several Democrats who poll head-to-head against the president quite well, and often as well as he does. Two, this is just a different era. Like, in terms of, especially at this juncture of the campaign, it's often how well can you communicate with people on social media? Can you get them to turn out for your events? Can you convert those social media followers into low-dollar donors, which then I think creates its own sort of type of momentum. And Joe Biden's more old school in terms of, like you said, raising money from kind of the big money folks inside the Democratic Party, doing this fairly conventionally. Look at the rollout. He's going to do it, in his home state. Then he's going to go to the 4 early states, and he's going to do the speeches you'd think that a Joe Biden would do. And so I think it's just a different time for him. Had he gotten in a month or two ago when everyone was saying he could be potentially the savior and protector of the Democratic Party, it'd be a different story. But the coverage of him over the last 3 weeks has been less than positive. And there's just been a lot, even the coverage of his announcement has been very much, he's going to do it this day, then he's going to do it that day, he might do it by video, might not do it by video. It just feels like it's not a well-oiled machine. And it feels like he's jumping in when there's a lot of Democrats who are generating excitement, right? If you look at Buttigieg, if you look at Bernie Sanders, if you look at Elizabeth Warren, if you look at Kamala Harris, there's a lot of pretty formidable people that he's running against who can make as good a claim as he can that they can beat Trump and that they can energize the Democratic Party, probably in a way that Joe Biden might have problems doing.
John Heilemann, let me just say, I've yet to talk to a Democratic activist or a Democratic fundraiser who is excited about Joe Biden getting in the race. And I'll take it a step further, and I've been surprised, but almost every Democrat to a person that I have spoken with is concerned that this is going to end badly for Joe Biden and that he should not get into the race. And that is something I have heard repeatedly over the past several months. What about you?
Well, I think, yes, I think that's consistent with what a lot of people who report on politics and are tuned into this stuff have been hearing, Joe, including me. I would say that among people who are close to the vice president and people who consider themselves fans of Joe Biden, people who would be happy to live in an America where Joe Biden was the president, those is maybe the constituency that's most concerned about what's about to happen to him. They've seen what's happened, what's unfolded over these last few months, not just related to some of these issues with some women who said that he was sort of too familiar with them in some cases and it didn't respect their personal space, but also watching him kind of mishandle some questions related to how progressive he is and how he fits into the modern party. There are these issues that Jim just pointed to and that Mike pointed to. He's never been a good fundraiser. He's never been someone with a big fundraising base. He's not been a player in the era of internet small donor fundraising. He's never been a guy, although he has a coterie of loyalists around him who love him and support him. He's not, and demonstrably in 1988 and in 2008, both of those runs for president did not work out very well. So I think you're right to say, first of all, among activists, there's not a hue and cry. And activists obviously are not the whole of the Democratic Party, but there's a long chunk of yardage between now and the first votes. And there's not a lot of activists who are like crying out for Joe Biden. And among people who like him most and have his best interest at heart, you hear a pronounced sense of, I wouldn't say exactly fear, but concern that this might not go all that well.
I hear a lot of the same things, but remember, he's polling at or near the top of the Democratic field. He's got a long road ahead of him. There's a lot of time for him to make up that ground. Here's the latest Monmouth poll has Joe Biden on top of the race, 7 points up on Bernie Sanders. And at the end of the day, as Mike said, Joe, a lot of people are going to look at this race and say, who can beat Donald Trump? Who ends the Trump administration? And they may decide it's Joe Biden.
Well, I mean, the question is, Willie, how does he move this conversation forward? The last month, we've seen not overly negative stories about him, but there is a negative dynamic set into this campaign, and it is hard to see Joe Biden stirring up the type of excitement as, say, Kamala Harris did in her introduction, or that Mayor Pete is doing every day. So the question is, how does he change the dynamic? He's used to being treated well by the press. He's always been treated well by the press. Things may get much more difficult in this competitive Democratic primary.
I would say this, though, Joe. We're going to find out fairly quickly here. We're going to find out, I think, within the next 2 months, once the former vice president announces, once he gets out there on the trail, once he sees crowds, how big are the crowds, what's the response to him among the crowds, what's the emotion behind his campaign, what's the pitch of his campaign. That's all going to be laid out, I think, pretty quickly.
Jim Vandehei, before you go, last word on Biden. What do you think?
I mean, listen, I agree that he's leading in the polls, but so much of that really has to do with people know who Joe Biden is. It'll be really interesting. If you watch that CNN forum earlier this week with the 5 candidates, you have a party, you have most of your candidates, other than Buttigieg, who's just not saying that much specifically, who sound so far to the left of Joe Biden, who sound so far to the left of Democratic candidates that we've heard in the past. And they sound that way because that's what's resonating with the Democratic Party right now. So if you're not with them on Medicare for all and free college education and other topics, it's just tough right now.
The road begins tomorrow for Joe Biden. Jim Vandehei, thanks so much. Let's turn to some other.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.